Okay, this is the talk on carbon and nitrogen cycles. Here is a picture of the carbon cycle. So I'm going to write carbon up here above this. Carbon cycle. And what the carbon cycle is this element that we know as carbon. You may have heard of carbon dating before. Carbon is this element that cycles through nature. It's never destroyed, it's never made by anything, but it's just kind of passed from one place to the other. And so I'm going to start with it being here in the atmosphere, in the air. What happens typically is the CO2 goes into plants. So plants kind of breathe it in, you could think of it this way, through this process of photosynthesis. And they get to make themselves bigger and bigger because they absorb this carbon from the atmosphere. And now what happens with plants is sometimes they get eaten by animals. Sometimes people eat plants. Sometimes we cut these down and we burn them. Sometimes they rot in the ground for a long time and become something that's like a fossil fuel. So oil, coal, natural gas. So there's a lot of carbon in these as well. And then eventually we'll take those to a plant and we burn those. We have these emissions that return to the atmosphere. As animals take in carbon from something they eat, they cycle it back through the process of breathing. So we call that respiration. Sometimes we call it decomposition if the organism dies. And similar things happen with the aquatic systems as well. So fish kind of go through this cycle as well as land animals. Okay, so there's this process that involves carbon that is cycled through plants, through people and animals, through factories, and it all relates back to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which you probably know is one of the big topics on global warming. So is the Earth actually being heated up by this gas? Well, the gas is yes. It does heat up the Earth. Now, is it fully contributed because of us? That's another issue that we'll talk about more in class. The second one is the water cycle. This one's pretty easy. I think most of you know this one already. We have evaporation from lakes. Eventually, those can condense into clouds. The clouds can cause precipitation. And then that water can run off back down here. Sometimes plants take and expel some water, and that goes into the atmosphere as well and kind of follows this cycle all over again. So the water cycle is really pretty easy. The last one is nitrogen. Nitrogen is another element. So atmospheric nitrogen, which is an element, a lot like carbon is. And this follows a cycle as well. It goes through a lot of different places. Starting here, let's start with plants. So plants can break down, they decompose into very basic parts. And when they do so, that nitrogen can get passed through the decomposers. Now sometimes that goes into the soil and it goes through this process called nitrification. So this ammonia molecule is the one that stores the nitrogen. Through nitrification, that is put into a different form of nitrogen. Then some bacteria helps it. That bacteria allows it to be re-entered into different plants. So plants can't eat themselves to get nitrogen, but they need nitrogen. So it has to go through all of these steps to get there. Likewise, animals can eat the plants which contain nitrogen. The animal then dies and becomes decomposed, and that whole process starts over again. Similarly, nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, because our atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen, this can be broken down by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which can be used into plant roots. Or it can take the alternative path, going this way through ammonium, nitrification, and nitrates again. So I know this is getting a little bit messy down here, but the bottom line is, the big take-home message for this is nitrogen. This nitrogen here is cycled Okay, the nitrogen is cycled, the water is cycled, and carbon is cycled. So that means they can be reused. So cycled means reused. Okay, and we'll talk about how energy changes, but matter, so things like elements, can be recycled. Make sure you go on and watch the quiz, or take the quiz online for your 3 points, and that's the end of this note section.